I bought the phone on a Tuesday after my shift ended, and the sky was already turning the soft gray that means summer is giving up the receipt still warm in my hand, as if the paper itself understood that this was a small victory. Nothing loud or dramatic, just a box with clean edges and a weight that felt like possibility. My own money from a part-time clinic job folded into a decision that belonged to me for the first time. Not a family upgrade, not a shared plan, not a permission slip disguised as care, but a simple purchase that said I could choose something without asking. I sat in my car for a minute before turning the key, the box on the passenger seat catching the last light, the smell of plastic and cardboard opening into that new phone scent everyone jokes about, but no one names. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could make my chest feel lighter. I took the long way home, not because I needed to, but because the quiet felt earned, the radio low, the receipt tucked into the glove compartment like proof that this was real. I was 20 living in my father's house because rent was impossible and my car was in his name and the insurance card in my wallet carried his policy number because the phone plan on my old device was a family plan with a location toggle I had never been allowed to turn off because the health insurance that covered my clinic visits came from his job and the unspoken rule in our house was that dependence was called responsibility when he named it. I parked in the driveway just as the porch light clicked on the house, already watching me the way it always did, and I carried the box inside with a carefulness that surprised me as if it could shatter from attention. He was in the kitchen back to me, the sound of the faucet filling the space where words usually went, and when he turned, he looked at the box before he looked at my face. His eyes measuring without asking. His mouth settling into that line that meant I had crossed a boundary he would never explain. I said I bought a phone, kept my voice even, mentioned my paycheck like a fact, and he nodded once. The kind of nod that ends conversations without starting them. There was no explosion, no raised voice, no slammed doors, just a quiet that felt heavier than sound, and that was how it always started. Dinner happened like a performance, plates passed, questions asked that were not really questions. Where did you buy it? How much did it cost? Did you keep the receipt? And I answered because answering had kept the peace for years. Later in my room, I slid the phone from its box and powered it on the screen, blooming to life like a clean page, my hands shaking a little as I set it up without connecting it to anything shared, no family account, no location bubble glowing on someone else's map, and the relief surprised me enough that I laughed once quietly into my pillow. The knock came not long after measured controlled, and when I opened the door, he did not step inside. He did not need to. His presence filled the hallway. His questions sharpened his rules, recited as concern, his disappointment framed as fear, and the words pressed closer until my room felt smaller than it had ever been. The rest of the evening moved like water downhill, inevitable, and I remember thinking that this could still end with me apologizing that I could still say I would return it, that peace could be purchased with surrender, and then the memory breaks into fragments, the sound of something falling. The way the air changed the moment when I realized I was not in control of the story anymore. I remember the sirens before. I remember the pain. Red and blue slicing the dark, my name spoken by someone who did not know me. The back doors of an ambulance closing with a finality that felt like a decision had been made without my consent. In the emergency room, the lights were too bright and the questions too practiced, date of birth, allergies, medications, and I said I fell because saying that had always worked because it was easier to carry a lie than to invite consequences I could not see. A nurse with gray hair pulled the curtain closed and lowered her voice. Not unkind, not urgent, just steady, and she said, "I am not here to get anyone in trouble." "But what you are describing is not an accident." She asked again, slower this time, whether someone had hurt me, whether I felt safe going home, whether this was the first time and the words pressed against something in me that had been sealed for years. I watched her face as I spoke around the truth. Watched how she did not rush me, how she named the next steps without threat, how she explained that they ask these questions because patterns matter, because injuries tell stories even when people do not. The monitor beeped softly, a metronome for a moment I could not undo, and she asked the question that ended the night the way it had begun, quietly with gravity, with a choice that did not feel like a choice at all. "Do you feel safe at home?" and as the curtain stirred with the air from the hallway, I understood that a receipt I had folded into my glove compartment had brought me here, that buying something small with my own money had pulled a thread I could not push back, and that this was not about a phone, and that whatever I said next would change the shape of my life. I did not understand how much weight a phone carried in our house until I tried to own one myself, because for years it had never been just a device, but a set of rules that lived in my pocket and followed me room to room. The old phone issued to me like a badge that proved I was still inside the circle of acceptable behavior. My password written down once and never forgotten my location, a small glowing dot that could be checked at will. My messages glanced at under the excuse of concern, and every time I felt a flicker of irritation, I told myself this was normal, that parents worried that rules were love wearing a uniform. He called it protecting, said the world was dangerous and girls my age did not understand how quickly things could go wrong, and when I tried to argue, he would lower his voice and list the things he paid for the roof, the car, the insurance card that lived behind my license, the phone plan that made sure I was never stranded, and the math always ended the same way, with me owing him something that could not be repaid. Over time, I learned how to preempt the questions by answering them before they were asked. Learned to keep my battery charged so there would be no reason for panic, learned to text when I arrived, and when I left, learned to accept that privacy was a luxury I had not earned yet, and the more I complied, the easier it became to mistake obedience for peace. There were moments when I felt the wrongness of it like a pressure behind my eyes, like when I noticed how my friends turned off their location without asking, or how they bought their own devices without a conversation, and I would tell myself that their families were different, that I was lucky to have someone who cared enough to check. My mother rarely said anything when it came up, her silence practiced and smooth, a hand on my shoulder as if to steady me, a look that said, "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." And I took that as a sign that the rules were not worth challenging. The phone became the easiest way to keep order because it was small and constant, because it could be framed as safety instead of control, because it did not leave marks and did not require raised voices, just a reminder now and then that someone was watching. When I started my part-time clinic job, the hours gave me a taste of independence that arrived quietly, a paycheck that was modest, but mine a routine that did not revolve around his schedule. And I felt the itch of choice in small ways, what to eat on break, which route to drive home, whether to sit in my car for a few minutes after work and breathe. The idea of buying a phone with that money grew slowly, not as rebellion, but as a solution to a problem I had learned to name, that every message I sent felt like it belonged to someone else first. I told myself it was practical, that my old phone lagged and the battery failed, that I needed reliability for work. And those reasons were true enough to quiet the part of me that knew there was something deeper at stake. What I did not expect was how the purchase would expose the scaffolding that had been holding our household upright, how a rectangle of glass could challenge a system that depended on me being traceable and agreeable and quiet. When he asked for the password to the new phone, I hesitated just a beat too long, and that pause did more damage than any argument could have, because it named a boundary I had never set before. He said he needed it in case of emergencies, and I said I would share my location if something happened, trying to split the difference the way I always had, and the room cooled, the air thickening with disappointment that sounded like concern, a familiar script delivered with new urgency. That was when I understood that the phone was never about communication. It was about access, about reassurance that I could be reached and checked and corrected, about the comfort that came from knowing my independence had a ceiling. In our house, rules were explained as temporary, something I would outgrow when I proved myself responsible. But the proof kept moving. Responsibility defined as agreement. Maturity measured by how little friction I caused. Each time I complied, the bar shifted just enough to keep me reaching, and the phone was the most efficient lever because it turned my life into a series of data points that could be interpreted without listening to me. Looking back, I can see how often the device became a stand-in for trust. How a buzzing notification could end a conversation before it started, how the act of checking in replaced the work of being believed. The night everything changed did not begin with shouting, because it never did. It began with a question that assumed an answer, with a reminder that independence came with consequences, with a tone that suggested I was choosing danger over family, and my chest tightened as I recognized the pattern even as I hoped I was wrong. I remember thinking that if I explained it better, he would understand that if I emphasized the safety features and the cost savings and the logic of it all, he would see reason, and I remember the slow realization that reason was not the point. The phone was never just a phone because it represented a decision made without permission, a future imagined without oversight, a step taken outside the narrow path that had kept things calm. By the time the evening tipped into something I could not reframe, the device on my desk had already done its work, not by ringing or glowing, but by existing, by proving that I could choose something for myself and survive the choosing, and that knowledge, once learned, refused to be put back in the box. The house I grew up in looked ordinary from the street, a trimmed lawn, a porch that caught the afternoon sun, a living room arranged to suggest calm. But inside, it ran on rules that were never written down because writing them would have made them easier to challenge, rules that lived in tone and timing, and the way questions were asked until they stopped being questions at all. You did not buy things for yourself without checking first. You did not make plans that could not be traced. You did not lock doors inside the house. You did not argue facts when he had already decided what they meant. And above all, you did not name the rules because naming them made them visible, and visibility was dangerous. From the time I was old enough to remember, decisions came dressed as advice, and advice hardened into expectations so gradually that it felt natural to follow, like staying within lines you had learned to see before you knew there were other ways to draw. When friends came over, I watched how they spoke freely, how they laughed too loud, how they drifted from room to room without announcing themselves, and I learned to compensate by becoming smaller, quieter, easier, the kind of daughter who did not need managing because she managed herself. My mother moved through this system with practiced grace, smoothing edges before they cut, translating his moods into meals and errands and reminders that it was not worth upsetting him, that he worked hard, that stress did strange things to people. And when I searched her face for permission to push back, she would offer sympathy without support, a look that said, "I understood, but not enough to stand beside you." It was easier to think of her silence as protection than to accept it as agreement, and so I told myself she was doing the best she could, that survival required compromise, that love sometimes asked you to wait. The rules extended beyond the obvious shaping. How I thought about myself, how much space I took up, how quickly I apologized when nothing was wrong, and over time the house taught me a language that replaced instinct with caution, desire with calculation. If I came home later than expected, the questions arrived fully formed. Not "where were you," but "why did you not answer? Why is your phone battery low? Why did your location pause for 3 minutes?" And I learned that answers were evaluated not for truth, but for compliance. That the safest response was one that reduced future questions. Even kindness followed rules, praise given when I anticipated needs approval, granted when I aligned my plans with his affection, offered as a reward for harmony rather than as a constant, and because it was inconsistent, I learned to chase it, mistaking relief for love. In that house, privacy was treated like secrecy, and secrecy was treated like betrayal. So I learned to keep nothing to myself. Not because I had nothing to hide, but because hiding implied guilt. When I brought home pay stubs from my clinic job, he asked where the money would go, not as curiosity, but as accounting. And when I suggested saving, he smiled as if at a child playing grown-up, reminding me that big decisions belonged to him until I was truly independent, a word that hovered just out of reach. Independence was promised like a destination on a map that kept changing, always one condition away, one more year, one more proof, one more demonstration that I could be trusted to make choices that matched his. I absorbed the lesson that peace was fragile, and my responsibility that if something broke, it was because I had pushed too hard or moved too fast, and that if I wanted safety, I should not test the edges. The house rewarded predictability, so I became predictable. My habits narrowing until my days fit neatly into expectations, and in that narrowing, I lost track of what I wanted because wanting required imagining something different. Looking back, I can see how the rules trained me to doubt my reactions, to second-guess my memories, to explain away discomfort as misunderstanding, and how that doubt made it easier for the system to run without resistance. When I felt uneasy, I told myself I was being dramatic when I felt angry. I told myself I was ungrateful, and when I felt afraid, I told myself fear was a sign I needed guidance. The phone I bought with my own money collided with these rules because it did not ask permission to exist, because it represented a choice made quietly and competently, and because it suggested a version of me that did not need constant correction. That is why the house reacted the way it did, not with chaos, but with enforcement, the rules asserting themselves to restore balance as they understood it. In that moment, I realized that the house did not want me to grow so much as it wanted me to remain manageable, and that manageability had been mistaken for safety for so long that no one questioned the cost. I had learned to survive by staying within the lines, by making myself legible to someone else, by letting the rules speak for me. And as I stood in my room with a new phone on my desk and an old weight in my chest, I understood that questioning the rules meant questioning the story I had been told about who I was allowed to be. The night everything changed began the way so many others had, with routine doing its best impression of safety, dishes drying on the rack, the television murmuring in the other room, the quiet hum of a house settling into evening, and I remember thinking that if I stayed calm enough, nothing would tip, that if I moved carefully, the rules would hold. He asked where I had been, and I answered. He asked who I had seen, and I answered, and the questions tightened in a way I had learned to recognize each one, narrowing the space around me without raising a voice. When his eyes went to the phone on my desk, I felt my stomach drop, the newness of it suddenly loud, and he said, "We needed to talk," like that was a favor, like this was an opportunity to fix something I had broken. I told him again that I paid for it, that I needed it for work, that it was just a phone, and even as I spoke, I could hear how small my reasons sounded inside a house that measured worth in obedience. He said I was being difficult, that I was pushing, that I did not understand how dangerous the world was, and when I tried to explain that I did understand, I felt the conversation slide past me, my words no longer landing where I aimed them. The air felt charged, not explosive but brittle, and I remember noticing how my hands had gone cold, how my thoughts began to arrange themselves around escape routes, apology routes, any route that would return us to normal. He stepped closer, and the room seemed to shrink, not because of anything dramatic, but because proximity had always been part of how control worked here, a reminder that space was granted, not assumed. I said I would return the phone, heard myself offer it like a peace treaty, and for a moment, I believed that would be enough, that surrender would reset the clock. What followed did not arrive as a single event, but as a blur of moments I could not organize until later, raised voices I could not place in time, the sound of something hitting the floor, my own breathing turning sharp and unfamiliar, and the sense that the rules had failed to contain what they were meant to manage. I remember the floor under my cheek and the smell of cleaner from earlier that evening. The way the light from the hallway made everything look unreal, and the thought that kept repeating itself was not fear, but confusion. How did we get here from a phone? I wanted to call it an accident because accidents are clean, because accidents do not ask you to reconsider your life, because accidents mean no one meant to hurt anyone, and that word rose to my mouth automatically the way it always had. But lying there, I felt something shift, a line crossed quietly and permanently. And even as I tried to frame what had happened in familiar language, I could not make the pieces fit. The sirens came from far away, and then all at once the sound filling the street and cutting through the house with an authority that did not belong to him, and as strangers moved around me, I felt both exposed and oddly relieved, like the secret had finally stepped into the open air. In the ambulance, the ceiling lights flickered past, and someone asked my name, asked what happened, and I said I fell, because saying that had always protected me, because accidents closed doors instead of opening them. At the hospital, the night stretched thin paperwork and questions looping until they blurred, and I focused on small details to keep myself steady, the texture of the blanket, the rhythm of a machine, the way the clock refused to move. Each time someone asked me what happened, I repeated the same answer, the word accident, doing its work, smoothing edges, keeping the story manageable. But beneath that word, another awareness grew quiet and insistent. The knowledge that calling it an accident was not making me safer. It was only postponing something I would have to face. When the doctor finished and the nurse adjusted the bed, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with pain. A weight made of understanding, and I stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the times I had explained bruises and aches away, all the times I had accepted blame for moments that did not make sense. The memory of the phone on my desk returned to me then, absurd and sharp, and I understood that the purchase had not caused what happened. It had revealed it that the night had not changed him so much as it had stripped away the language I used to excuse him. In that moment, I stopped calling it an accident, not out loud, not yet, but inside myself. And the honesty of that admission scared me more than anything else because it demanded action. I remember the sirens before I remember the pain. By the time the questions began, I had learned how to answer without answering, how to shape words into something that sounded complete while leaving the center untouched. And the emergency room made it easy to keep that habit because the process itself moved fast enough to carry me along. Wristband, placed vitals, taken forms, slid across a tray, names repeated until they felt borrowed. A social worker introduced herself with a calm voice and explained that they ask everyone the same questions, that it was routine, that there were resources if I needed them, and I nodded and said I understood because understanding was safer than explaining. She asked if anyone had hurt me, and I said no. She asked if I felt safe at home, and I said yes. She asked if this had happened before, and I said I fell, and each answer landed like a stone placed carefully to keep a bridge from swaying. When she left the room, the quiet returned, interrupted only by the beeping of a monitor that marked time without caring what it measured, and I focused on breathing evenly, on keeping my face neutral, on doing what I had always done when attention turned toward me. The nurse with gray hair came back then, not with urgency, but with intention, and she pulled the curtain closed again, the sound soft but decisive, and I noticed how she stood so that her body blocked the doorway without making a show of it. She did not repeat the same questions. She did not raise her voice. She did not challenge me. She simply said that falls usually tell a certain story, and this one did not, that she had been doing this long enough to recognize when an explanation fit and when it was being used as a shield. She said she was not there to get anyone in trouble, and that line mattered because trouble had always been the reason I stayed quiet, and then she asked me again if someone had hurt me, not quickly this time, but slowly, leaving space for the answer to form. I felt my face warm with shame that surprised me in its intensity. Shame at being seen and shame at being believed, and for a moment I wanted to disappear into the sheet, to rewind the night to the part where I could still choose silence without consequence. The words stuck in my throat, and I shook my head not in denial, but in confusion, because admitting it felt like stepping into a room I had never been allowed to enter. She waited without filling the space, and that waiting did something to me. It made room for a thought I had not let myself finish before, that maybe telling the truth did not mean losing everything at once. I said I fell again softer, and she nodded as if acknowledging the effort it took to keep saying it. Then asked a different question, whether this was the first time I had been hurt like this, and the question landed with a weight I could not redirect. Images flickered through my mind, moments I had filed away, as clumsiness or bad luck explanations rehearsed until they felt real, and my chest tightened as I realized how carefully I had curated a history that allowed me to stay. The nurse said patterns matter because patterns tell us what is likely to happen next, and the word next echoed in my head louder than the machines, louder than the hallway. I thought about going home, about the rules waiting there, about the quiet that would settle if I apologized enough, and for the first time, that quiet did not feel like safety. It felt like a delay. I told her I was scared, and the admission surprised us both. The sound of it plain and small, and she nodded again. Not triumphant, not urgent, just steady, and said, "Thank you for telling me." Then explained what the hospital could do and what it could not do, how nothing would happen without my consent unless there was immediate danger, how documentation worked, how resources existed, whether I chose to use them now or later. She called the social worker back, and this time I listened. Really listened to the options laid out without pressure, to the language of choice that did not sound like an ultimatum. When they asked me again what happened, I hesitated, the habit of minimizing pulling at me, and then I said I was not sure how to say it yet, which felt like a truth I could stand behind. The nurse squeezed my hand once, a brief contact that grounded me in the present, and said that was enough for now, that naming it takes time, that the important thing was that I did not have to do it alone. The social worker explained that they would document what I shared, that I would leave with discharge paperwork and instructions that if I wanted full records later, there was a process, and the practicality of it all helped me breathe, helped me see a path that did not require me to decide everything in one night. As they stepped out to give me space, I stared at the ceiling and felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly, but permission, the sense that the story I had been telling myself was no longer the only one available. The question that changed everything was not the first one or the loudest one. It was the one asked with patience, the one that assumed I was worth protecting, even if I could not yet say why. And as the curtain swayed with the movement of the hallway, I understood that whatever happened next would be shaped by whether I trusted that assumption enough to keep speaking. What I took home with me was not justice or clarity or even certainty. It was a thin stack of papers folded into a plastic sleeve and tucked carefully into my bag papers that looked ordinary enough to anyone else but felt heavier than anything I had carried before. The discharge nurse went over them with the same calm professionalism she used for everyone, explaining the diagnosis summary in neutral language, the instructions for follow-up care. The signs to watch for that would mean I needed to come back, and I nodded and listened, because listening had always been one of my strengths. There was no dramatic file handed over, no thick chart revealing everything at once, no moment where the truth was bound neatly between covers. Just a visit summary with timestamps, clinical observations, written in careful words, and a note that injuries were consistent with what I had reported at the time. I noticed the phrasing because noticing phrasing was part of my job, because words mattered in systems that pretended they did not, and I understood immediately what these papers were and what they were not. They were not a weapon, they were not proof of everything, but they were a starting point, a record that existed outside my memory, something that did not change when fear did. I signed where I was told to sign, accepted the copy offered to me, and slipped it into my bag with a care that surprised me, as if the paper itself could be damaged by impatience. The nurse reminded me that full medical records could be requested later through the patient portal or the records office, that it usually took a few days, sometimes longer, and the ordinary timeline of it all steadied me, made the future feel like a series of steps instead of a cliff. When I left the hospital, the night air felt cooler than I expected, the parking lot lights casting long shadows that made everything look slightly unreal, and I stood for a moment breathing it in, grounding myself in the fact that I was upright and alive and leaving under my own power. I did not go home. That decision arrived quietly, without ceremony, shaped by the memory of the nurse's voice and the weight of the papers in my bag, and I texted a friend instead, keeping the message short, asking if I could stay the night, and when she replied yes without questions, I felt a tightness in my chest loosen just enough to breathe. In her spare room, I laid the papers out on the bedspread and read them again, slower this time. The way I read claims at work, when something felt off, scanning for dates and times, noticing how the language avoided conclusions while still documenting facts. I took photos of each page with my new phone, the irony not lost on me, and saved them in a folder labeled simply "Hospital," because labeling things plainly made them easier to find when emotions threatened to scatter my thoughts. I reminded myself that this was not the full chart, that imaging reports and nursing notes and physician assessments would come later if I asked for them, and that asking would be a process, not an act of defiance. The restraint of it mattered to me, the sense that I was not stealing anything or bending rules, just exercising a right that had always existed whether I used it or not. In the days that followed, I carried the discharge papers with me like a quiet anchor, not to show anyone, but to remind myself that the night had happened, that it was recorded somewhere beyond my own account, that I was not imagining the seriousness of it, because seriousness had been coded into a system that did not know my father's explanations. When the soreness faded and the bruises changed color, I found myself reaching for the folder again, checking the dates, grounding myself in the sequence of events. And each time I did, the urge to minimize softened a little more. At work, I processed charts and claims with the same focus I always had, but I noticed how documentation standards guided everything, how objective language carried weight precisely because it did not argue, and I understood why the nurse had been so careful with her words. The system was not built to take sides, it was built to record, and recording was its own form of power. I thought about the social worker's explanation of resources and timelines, about how nothing had been forced, and yet something had shifted irrevocably, and I realized that what I took home with me was not just paperwork, but permission. Permission to treat my experience as something that could be documented rather than explained away. The papers did not tell me what to do next. They did not solve the problem of where I would live or how my father would react, but they gave me something solid to hold on to when doubt crept in, a reminder that there was a version of events that did not depend on my ability to convince anyone. When I slid the folder back into my bag and zipped it closed, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve, the awareness that this was only the beginning, paired with the knowledge that beginnings mattered. What I took home with me was evidence in its earliest form, incomplete and understated, but real, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that reality might be enough if I learned how to use it carefully. The first thing I learned after leaving the hospital was that truth does not arrive first stories do, and my father told his before I had finished figuring out how to tell mine. By the time I woke up the next morning, there were messages waiting not to ask how I was, but to explain me. A cousin saying she heard I had been acting out, an aunt asking if I was taking my medication, a family friend reminding me that stress can make young people do impulsive things. The language was careful and concerned and already decided, and I could hear his voice inside it even when his name was not mentioned, the steady framing that turned worry into credibility and control into protection. He told them I had fallen because I was careless, that I had been pushing boundaries lately, that the new job had gone to my head, that I was tired and emotional, and dramatic words chosen to soften the edges of what had happened while sharpening the picture of who I was becoming. He said he was afraid for me, afraid I was spiraling, afraid I would hurt myself, and fear is a powerful currency in families that value appearances because it buys agreement without requiring proof. When I did not answer his calls, he left a voicemail that sounded almost gentle, reminding me that the house was still my home if I wanted to calm down, warning me not to listen to people who would put ideas in my head, telling me he would always take care of me even when I made things difficult. I felt the pull of it immediately, the familiar gravity of being defined by someone else, and the relief that came with letting them carry the narrative. And for a moment, I considered stepping back into it, because stepping back would have been easier than standing alone in a story no one else recognized yet. Then the pressure increased. He texted that if I did not come home, he would have to make some decisions for my own good, that the insurance situation could not remain uncertain, that he needed to know where I was, for safety reasons, that he might call the police to report me missing because he was worried, and each message was framed as responsibility while tightening the net. I imagined officers knocking on my friend's door, imagined explaining myself through a lens already clouded by concern. Imagined being asked why I was running, and my stomach knotted with the knowledge that systems listen to the first account they receive. He called my workplace next, not accusing but inquiring, asking whether I had been stressed, whether I had been reliable, whether they had noticed changes, and while they did not share anything, the very act of asking felt like a reach across a boundary I had not known how to draw. The smear campaign did not look like shouting or threats. It looked like worry, deployed strategically, like a map being drawn around me that left fewer and fewer places to stand without being interpreted. Family group chats filled with messages urging me to come home and talk it out, reminding me of everything my father had done for me, warning me not to ruin relationships over a misunderstanding, and I read them all with a sinking recognition of how quickly concern could become consensus. I tried to respond once, typing and deleting words that sounded either defensive or ungrateful, and in the end I said nothing, because silence had always been my safest option, and I had not yet learned how to use it differently. At night, the doubts crept in, whispering that maybe I had overreacted, that maybe the hospital had made too much of it, that maybe going back would restore the balance everyone seemed so invested in preserving. I took the discharge papers out again and laid them on the bed. Read the timestamps and the neutral language reminded myself that the facts did not change because people preferred a different story, and that grounding myself in documentation was not cruelty, but clarity. The pressure escalated when he threatened to come get me, not as a demand, but as a plan, saying he would pick me up after work because he did not like me staying with friends, and I realized then how easily concern could tip into control when unchecked. I called the social worker whose number I had saved and explained what was happening. my voice shaking as I named the fear that I was losing ground before I had taken a step, and she listened and validated what I was experiencing without inflaming it, reminding me that smear campaigns thrive on urgency and that slowing down was a form of protection. She suggested documenting the messages and voicemails not to retaliate but to establish a record, and the practicality of that advice steadied me, gave me something to do besides spiral. I saved screenshots and audio files into a folder alongside my hospital paperwork, labeling dates and times, noticing patterns in tone and timing that mirrored the questions he used to ask at home. Each saved file felt like a small act of defiance against a narrative that wanted to swallow me whole, and yet the cost of that defiance was immediate, a widening distance from people I loved, and a loneliness that pressed in when the house I grew up in closed ranks without me. I understood then that this was the first real setback, not because it meant I was wrong, but because it tested whether I could hold my ground without validation, whether I could trust a truth that had not yet been endorsed by anyone else. The story he told first traveled faster and sounded kinder, and I felt its pull every time my phone buzzed, but I also felt something else growing beneath the fear, a quiet resolve rooted in the knowledge that letting him define me again would not make me safe, it would only make me small. Seeing the pattern did not arrive as a revelation, but as a slow rearranging of memories that refused to stay where I had filed them. In the days after the messages and calls multiplied, I began to replay moments I had labeled clumsy or unlucky, and I watched them line up with an uncomfortable precision. The time I slipped on the stairs after being questioned for an hour about a friend he did not like. The morning my shoulder ached after a late-night conversation that ended with silence, and a door closed too hard. The headaches that followed evenings when the rules tightened and my breathing turned shallow. Each incident had an explanation ready and waiting, and I had accepted those explanations because acceptance kept the house quiet. Now, the quiet felt different. It felt like evidence being held together by habit rather than truth. I opened the folder on my phone and scrolled through dates, noticing how often discomfort followed conflict and how often my body carried what my mouth could not say. I remembered the doctor visits where I minimized the way I smiled and said I was fine, the way my father answered questions for me when I hesitated, his concern translating my silence into reassurance. I remembered the relief on his face when providers accepted the story and moved on. At the time, I had mistaken that relief for care. Looking back, I could see it was control regaining its footing. The pattern sharpened when I compared notes with my own calendar work shifts, circled in pin messages, time-stamped with familiar phrases that signaled a bad night ahead. I had thought of patterns as something other people had, something obvious and dramatic, not a series of small concessions that accumulated until there was no room left to stand. The emergency room visit stood out not because it was the worst, but because it interrupted the system long enough for someone else to ask a different question. That question did not invent the pattern, it illuminated it. I thought about the nurse saying patterns matter and understood that she meant outcomes repeat when conditions remain unchanged. That realization brought a wave of grief. I had not anticipated grief for the younger version of myself, who learned to explain pain away. Grief for the years I spent believing compliance was safety. I tried to remember the first time I learned that lesson and could not, which frightened me more than any single memory. At work, I watched charts move through the system and noticed how repetition guided decisions, how a history formed even when no one intended it to. And I wondered what history my records would tell if placed side by side. Not dramatic conclusions, just a rhythm of visits and explanations that leaned in one direction. I realized then that the emergency room was not the beginning of the story, but the point where denial ran out of space. This was not a one-time misunderstanding, and calling it that would not protect me. Seeing the pattern meant accepting that nothing would change unless something changed, and that truth settled into me with a weight that steadied rather than crushed. It did not tell me what to do next, but it told me what not to do. I could not go back and pretend this was isolated. I could not accept concern as a substitute for accountability. I could not keep offering my body as proof that things were manageable. The pattern explained why the smear campaign felt so effective, why the near constant pressure to return home carried urgency disguised as love. It explained why my doubts sounded rehearsed. Recognizing it did not make me brave overnight, but it gave my fear a shape, and fear with a shape can be measured. That measurement mattered because it replaced chaos with context. When I closed the folder and set the phone down, I felt the room settle around me, not into safety, but into clarity, and clarity was something I could work with. The pattern was real, and seeing it for the first time meant I could no longer unsee it, even when the cost of seeing would be high. I let myself sit with that clarity and notice how my body responded to it, the way my shoulders lowered when I stopped arguing with my own memory, the way my thoughts slowed when I stopped rehearsing explanations for someone who was not listening. I began to understand how control had trained me to rush to decide quickly before doubt could harden, and how slowing down was an act of resistance in itself. Each recollection that surfaced brought context rather than panic, a sense that events were connected by choice rather than chance, and that connection reduced the power of shame. I was not weak for missing the pattern earlier. I was trained not to see it, trained to prioritize harmony over accuracy, and accuracy had always felt dangerous. Naming the pattern did not erase affection or history, it simply placed them where they belonged, alongside responsibility. I could hold memories of kindness and still acknowledge harm, and that balance felt more honest than any single story I had been offered. The realization also reframed my future, turning vague dread into practical questions about safety and timing and support questions that could be answered one at a time. I understood that progress would be uneven, that some days the old explanations would try to return, but I also understood that once a pattern is recognized, it loses the ability to masquerade as coincidence. That loss mattered. It gave me a foothold. It reminded me that change begins with attention, and that attention can be learned even after years of looking away. And in learning it, I felt the first real sense that the future might be shaped by my choices rather than by the rules of that house, and that knowledge stayed with me afterward. Using the system without abusing it required me to slow my instincts and trust process over impulse, something that went against every reflex I had developed in that house where urgency was used to force compliance. I knew enough from my work to understand how easily systems break when people push them too hard, and how quietly they work when you meet them where they are designed to function. Documentation mattered not as ammunition, but as alignment, and my goal was not to punish anyone, but to make sure the record reflected reality accurately and consistently. I began by organizing what I already had: screenshots of messages saved with dates and times, voicemails downloaded and labeled, the discharge paperwork photographed, clearly all of it stored in folders that mirrored how claims files were built at the clinic. That familiarity grounded me. It reminded me that systems respond to clarity, not volume, and that restraint was often the most persuasive posture. I logged into the patient portal and requested my full medical records through the standard process, selecting the visit date and choosing electronic delivery, noting the expected turnaround of 48 to 72 hours. There was no drama in it, just a confirmation email and a waiting period that forced me to sit with uncertainty without trying to outrun it. While I waited, I reviewed the basics. I knew well how incident classification worked, how providers documented objective findings versus patient-reported history, how patterns emerged across visits without anyone needing to editorialize. I did not need a smoking gun because systems are not built to recognize intent. They are built to recognize repetition and consistency. When the records arrived, they were exactly what I expected: thorough, but restrained nursing notes describing observations, physician assessments using careful language, timestamps aligning with what I remembered, and nowhere did they draw conclusions they could not support. That was a relief. It meant the record stood on its own. I resisted the urge to share everything with everyone, resisted the pull to convince family members who had already chosen the easier story, and instead focused on preserving the integrity of what I had. At the social worker's suggestion, I kept a simple log of contact attempts, dates, times, summaries, not interpretations, and I noticed how quickly that log filled with entries that echoed one another in tone and timing. The repetition was the point. It showed escalation without requiring commentary. I consulted a local legal aid clinic for guidance, not to file anything yet, but to understand options and timelines, and they explained the difference between emergency orders and longer-term hearings in plain terms that helped me plan rather than panic. They emphasized consent and agency, that nothing would move forward without my decision unless there was immediate danger, and that knowledge returned a sense of control I had not felt in weeks. I practiced saying no without explaining, letting calls go to voicemail, responding to messages with neutral statements when response was necessary, and each boundary felt awkward at first, like wearing a new pair of shoes that pinched before they fit. There were moments when I worried that restraint would be read as weakness, that not pushing back publicly would allow his narrative to settle permanently. But the professionals I spoke with reminded me that timelines matter, that acting too fast can compromise outcomes, that patience is not passivity. The system does not reward spectacle, it rewards consistency. I reminded myself of that when the urge to confront surged, when the thought of calling him and demanding accountability felt like relief. Instead, I documented. I waited. I followed steps that were unremarkable on their own, but powerful in sequence. I learned how to phrase requests so they were processed efficiently, how to ask for confirmation without sounding accusatory, how to let the record accumulate without my fingerprints all over it. This was not about outsmarting anyone. It was about allowing the truth to appear without distortion. Each day that passed without me reacting publicly made space for the record to do its work. I understood then that using the system meant trusting that fairness is built into its slowness, that checks and balances exist precisely to prevent outcomes driven by fear or anger. Abusing the system would have meant exaggeration or shortcuts or attempts to force conclusions, and I refused to do that because I had lived too long under someone else's version of urgency. This time, I would move at a pace that protected me. The discipline of it was exhausting but clarifying, and as I followed the steps, I felt a quiet confidence grow, not because I knew how it would end, but because I knew I was proceeding in a way that could withstand scrutiny. That mattered to me more than speed. It meant that whatever happened next would be grounded in reality rather than reaction, and that was the foundation I needed before taking the next step. The near legal trap did not announce itself as a threat. It arrived dressed as reason and reconciliation, and that made it far more dangerous than anything loud. He left a voicemail that sounded calmer than he had in weeks, saying he wanted to help me reset, that families worked things out together, that we did not need to involve outsiders who would misunderstand our situation. He said he had scheduled an appointment with a counselor he trusted and that it would be good for me to attend just a conversation to clear the air. No pressure, no blame, and the ease of his tone stirred something old in me, the reflex to believe that peace was finally being offered. A follow-up text arrived with details and an address along with a reminder that he was still responsible for my insurance and that continuity of care mattered, the implication clear without being stated. When I hesitated, he framed it as concern for my health, saying stress could complicate recovery, that avoiding conflict was part of healing, and the language mirrored the advice I had been given at the hospital just closely enough to confuse me. I called the legal aid clinic again before responding, reading the message aloud, and the attorney paused in a way that made my stomach drop, then asked whether any paperwork had been mentioned. Within an hour, an email followed from my father with an attachment. A simple form he described as standard A liability waiver so the counselor could speak freely. Nothing to worry about, just a formality. I opened it slowly and recognized phrases that did not belong to therapy language about releasing claims, acknowledging misunderstandings, agreeing that any injuries were accidental clauses that would not have stood out to me months earlier but now glowed like warning lights. Signing it would not have ended the matter, it would have rewritten it, collapsing weeks of careful documentation into a single admission that nothing had happened. My hands shook as I imagined how close I had come to saying yes, how easily the trap could have closed if I had gone to that appointment and signed what was put in front of me, trusting the familiar pressure to comply. He followed up with another message when I did not respond softer this time, reminding me that refusing help would look bad, that people would worry that he might have to request a wellness check if I continued to isolate because he loved me and could not stand by while I deteriorated. The threat was wrapped in care, and that wrapping was what made it effective because it targeted the part of me that still wanted to be seen as reasonable. For an hour, I paced my friend's living room, rehearsing responses that explained and justified and apologized, the old scripts rising easily, and it took deliberate effort to set the phone down and breathe. I consulted the attorney again, and she was direct, telling me not to sign anything, not to attend any meeting where documents might be presented, to keep communication in writing and neutral, and to save everything. She explained how wellness checks can be misused to regain control and how important it was to establish a paper trail showing restraint on my part. The clarity of her advice steadied me, and I drafted a brief response that thanked him for the concern and stated that any communication should go through my attorney, nothing more. Sending it felt like stepping off a ledge. The fear, immediate and visceral, but also clean, like a decision made without bargaining. The backlash was swift, a flurry of messages accusing me of overreacting, of being manipulated, of choosing strangers over family, followed by silence that rang just as loudly. That silence was part of the trap too, designed to pull me back into appeasement, and I had to remind myself that discomfort was not danger. I documented the messages, the attachment, the timing, adding them to the log with the same neutral care I had used for everything else, and in doing so, I felt the line between fear and clarity sharpen. The near miss left me shaken because it revealed how easily the system could be turned against me if I moved without guidance. How thin the margin was between protection and erasure. It also confirmed what the pattern had suggested, that control would adapt when challenged, that when one lever failed, another would be tried. Recognizing that adaptation helped me understand why patience mattered, why acting alone was risky, why using the system meant respecting its safeguards as much as its tools. That night I slept poorly, dreams looping through what might have happened if I had signed, if I had gone, if I had tried to smooth things over the old way, and I woke with a resolve that felt heavier but steadier than before. Avoiding the trap did not feel like victory, it felt like survival, and that distinction mattered because it kept me cautious. The setback had nearly undone weeks of careful work, and seeing how close it came forced me to recommit, to process over impulse to boundaries, over explanations to the understanding that reconciliation offered without accountability is not peace but leverage. The temporary order arrived faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, a contradiction that defined the weeks that followed, because urgency and patience shared the same space once the paperwork was filed. With guidance, I submitted a request for an emergency protective order attaching the limited but solid documentation. I had the discharge summary, the contact log, the messages that showed escalation without commentary, and I remember the clerk explaining the process in a voice that was neither sympathetic nor cold, just practiced as if calm itself were part of the infrastructure. The judge reviewed the request without theatrics and granted a temporary order that afternoon, a narrow boundary drawn quickly to stop immediate contact. And when I read the language, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Relief that someone else had named the risk, and disbelief that something so small on paper could hold back something that had felt so large in my life. The order did not decide anything permanent. It did not assign blame or tell a story. It simply created space, and that space felt both protective and exposed, like standing under a canopy that kept the rain off while leaving the sides open to wind. He reacted exactly as I had been warned he might, with indignation that framed itself as injury messages sent through intermediaries that insisted this was unnecessary, that I was overreacting, that paperwork could not capture family context, and then silence punctuated by sudden attempts to test the boundary. Each attempt was logged and forwarded as instructed, not with anger but with consistency. And each time I did it, my hands shook a little less. The order came with a hearing date set several weeks out, a future point where evidence would be considered more fully, and that wait became its own trial days, stretching with a vigilance I had not practiced before, listening for footsteps that would not come, checking locks I had never needed to check, reminding myself that discomfort did not mean danger. Friends asked how I was doing, and I struggled to answer because the truth was uneven. I was safer than before and more anxious than ever, my body still expecting correction, even as the rules changed. The legal aid attorney explained that this limbo was normal, that temporary orders are designed to stop harm while due process unfolds, and that the slowness protected everyone involved, including me, from decisions made in fear. Understanding that helped, but did not erase the pressure. especially when family members reached out to urge reconciliation before the hearing, warning me that court would make everything worse, that I would regret airing private matters, that forgiveness was a better path. I learned to respond with brief statements that acknowledged concern without engaging the argument, a skill that felt unnatural but necessary, and I practiced it until my voice steadied. The weeks became a study in restraint, choosing not to correct misinformation, not to argue publicly, not to reach for the relief of being understood at the expense of the record. Each day, I checked the calendar and then forced myself to stop checking, because living in anticipation can become its own trap, and I needed my attention for ordinary things like work and sleep and meals that did not taste like fear. The order required adjustments that made independence visible, changing routes, adjusting schedules, learning how to exist without the constant awareness of being monitored, and those adjustments were both freeing and disorienting, like learning a new gait after walking a certain way for years. I noticed how my shoulders dropped when my phone did not buzz with demands, how silence began to feel neutral instead of threatening, and I reminded myself that this quiet was not abandonment, but boundary. There were moments when doubt surged, when the thought of the hearing tightened my chest, when I wondered whether the judge would see the pattern, or whether the story told first would still cast a shadow, and in those moments I returned to the basics, the documentation, the timelines, the fact that systems value consistency over persuasion. I met with the attorney to prepare for what would come next, not rehearsing speeches, but reviewing facts, dates, and procedures, understanding what the hearing would and would not do, and that preparation grounded me in reality rather than imagination. The temporary order did not fix anything, but it changed the terrain, shifting the burden away from my ability to endure and onto a process designed to assess risk, and that shift mattered more than I had expected. It meant that for the first time, my safety did not depend on my compliance or my explanations. It depended on a boundary recognized by someone outside the house, where rules went unquestioned. As the hearing date approached, the pressure intensified, messages arriving through others, urging me to reconsider, to remember family, to think about the future, and I felt the pull of old loyalties tug against the new clarity I had built. Each time I wavered, I read the order again, not as a shield, but as a reminder that I had chosen a path that valued safety over comfort, and that choice deserved follow-through. The temporary order was not an ending. It was a pause that allowed truth to catch up to urgency. And in that pause, I learned that waiting can be an act of courage when it is done with intention. The hearing did not feel like a climax so much as a narrowing, a room drawing its boundaries around facts and procedures until there was less and less space for performance. We arrived early because being early gave me something to do with my nerves, and I sat with my hands folded, listening to the low murmur of voices that carried no interest in our story beyond its order on the docket. When my case was called, the judge explained the scope in plain terms, what would be considered and what would not, reminding everyone that this was not a trial about character, but a determination of risk and necessity. That framing mattered because it stripped the situation of the moral theater my father relied on, replacing it with a checklist that did not care how persuasive he sounded. My attorney spoke briefly and clearly, referencing dates and documents without embellishment, and I recognized the same discipline I used at work when a claim needed to be understood quickly by someone with no patience for narrative. The discharge summary was entered, the contact log was referenced, the timeline laid out without adjectives, and I watched the judge follow along, eyes moving from page to page, asking questions that clarified sequence rather than motive. When I was asked to speak, I kept my answers short and factual, resisting the urge to justify my feelings or argue intent, because I had learned that the record carried more weight than emotion in rooms like this. My father spoke next, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest as he leaned into concern, describing me as overwhelmed and confused, framing his actions as protective, insisting that misunderstandings had been escalated unnecessarily. The difference now was not in what he said, but in how it landed, because the judge interrupted gently to ask about specific messages, about timing, about why certain contacts continued after requests to stop, and each interruption redirected the narrative back to behavior rather than intention. The pattern did not need to be declared dramatically. It appeared through repetition, through the alignment of dates and attempts and responses that told a story without commentary. I noticed how the room responded to that alignment, how neutrality favored consistency over charisma, and I felt a steadying calm replace the dread that had followed me for weeks. When my attorney addressed the near legal trap, she did so clinically referencing the attachment and its language, and the judge asked a single clarifying question that revealed why the offer mattered, not because of malice, but because of effect. My father's frustration surfaced then, a sharpness in his tone that contrasted with the concern he had presented earlier, and the shift did not help him. The judge took a moment to review the file again, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument, a pause that belonged to the process rather than to either of us. When the decision came, it was measured, the temporary order extended with specific conditions and a timeline for review boundaries set clearly enough to be enforceable without pretending to solve everything. There was no condemnation and no validation speech, just an explanation of why the order was necessary given the documented pattern and the risk of continued contact. I listened as if the words were being placed carefully into my hands, each one practical, each one limited, and I felt something in me release. Not triumph, but recognition, the sense that the story no longer depended on my ability to persuade. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, not lighter exactly, but more breathable, and I stood for a moment letting the outcome settle without rushing to assign it meaning. My father left without looking at me, and that absence felt final in a way I had not anticipated, a confirmation that control had lost its platform here. The attorney reviewed next steps emphasizing compliance and documentation, reminding me that orders are only as effective as they are respected, and I nodded because I understood now how much discipline mattered after decisions were made. As we walked to the car, I noticed the ordinary details of the day. The sound of traffic, the weight of my bag, the feel of my phone in my hand, and I realized that the hearing had not given me justice. In the cinematic sense, it had given me structure. That structure was enough to move forward without guessing enough to protect space, while I rebuilt the parts of my life that had been arranged around someone else's rules. I knew there would be consequences beyond the courtroom family reactions and quiet losses that would surface later, but in that moment I allowed myself to acknowledge what had happened without apology. The hearing had done what it was designed to do: assess risk, set boundaries, and return responsibility to the process, and in doing so, it shifted the center of gravity away from fear. As I left the building, I understood that the hardest part had not been speaking or waiting or documenting. It had been trusting that a system built on restraint could hold what my private explanations never could. Telling the truth did not end the conflict so much as it rearranged my life around a different set of absences, losses that arrived quietly and stayed. I lost the house first, not in a dramatic eviction, but in the simple way doors close. When you stop agreeing, my room emptied into boxes, my name removed from routines that had defined years, and the realization that returning was no longer an option, settling in with a dull finality. I lost the illusion of being understood by people who had known me all my life, relatives who stopped calling or who called only to say they hoped I would come to my senses, friends of the family who crossed the street to avoid conversations that might require choosing sides. I lost the ease of holidays, the automatic invitations, the shorthand that comes from shared history, and those losses stung in ways I did not expect because they were not punishments so much as withdrawals of belonging. Work became both refuge and reminder, a place where structure held and expectations were clear, where my value was measured by accuracy and reliability rather than compliance, and I leaned into that steadiness when nights stretched long and quiet. There were days when the cost felt too high, when I wondered whether silence would have been cheaper, when the memory of laughter around the old table tempted me to imagine reconciliation without accountability. And in those moments, I had to sit with the grief rather than argue with it. Grief showed up in ordinary places in grocery aisles when I reached for familiar brands and songs on the radio that reminded me of drives I would never repeat, in the reflex to check my phone before remembering that no one was tracking me anymore. Telling the truth also cost me the comfort of doubt, the soft place where responsibility could be blurred and choices postponed, because once the pattern was named, I could not unsee it. And unseeing would have required betraying myself in ways I was no longer willing to do. The silence that followed the hearing was different from the silence I had known before. Not the tense quiet of waiting for correction, but the hollow space left when connections are cut cleanly, and learning to live inside that space took practice. I moved into a small apartment with borrowed furniture and mismatched dishes, the kind of place that smelled faintly of paint and possibility. And each choice I made there felt both exhilarating and exhausting because there was no one to approve or disapprove. I learned how much energy it takes to decide everything for yourself when you have been trained to defer, and I learned how quickly that energy returns when fear is not siphoning it away. There were practical costs, too, the insurance changes, the budgeting adjustments, the reality of building independence faster than planned, and I faced those challenges with a mix of anxiety and pride that surprised me. I discovered that safety is not free, but it is sustainable, that paying for your own peace feels different than earning approval, and that difference reshaped how I measured success. The hardest loss was the one I could not itemize, the loss of the story I had told myself about family being unconditional about love, excusing harm if intentions were good enough, and grieving that story felt like grieving a person who never existed. I had to allow myself to feel anger without letting it calcify into bitterness, to acknowledge affection without letting it erase boundaries, to hold complexity without using it as an escape hatch back into danger. Some nights I replayed conversations and imagined alternate endings where accountability arrived earlier and apologies were real, and I let those fantasies pass without chasing them because chasing them kept me stuck. What telling the truth gave me was not vindication, but alignment, the ability to live without the constant negotiation between what I felt and what I said, and that alignment brought a steadiness I had never known. My body responded first, sleeping deeper, breathing easier, releasing tension I had normalized, and I took those changes as evidence that safety is felt before it is articulated. Over time, new routines replaced old ones, mornings that belonged to me, evenings that ended without dread, and friendships built on mutual respect rather than shared history. And those gains did not erase the losses, but they balanced them. I learned that courage is not loud, and that choosing yourself does not look like winning. It looks like continuing after the applause fades, after the messages stop, after the cost is paid in full. Telling the truth cost me family as I had known it, but it gave me something I had never had before. A life that did not require shrinking to fit a sense of ownership that extended beyond objects to decisions, and the quiet confidence that comes from standing inside your own story without apology. My life did not reset all at once after everything ended. It settled slowly and deliberately, the way dust falls after a long storm, and in that settling I learned what peace actually feels like when it is not borrowed or conditional. I kept the phone I bought with my own money, not because it was special anymore, but because it reminded me of the first decision I made without permission and survived the object that exposed a truth I had spent years circling without naming. In my apartment, it rested on a small table by the door screen, uncracked notifications quiet, and I noticed how often I forgot to check it because no one was waiting to question where I had been or why. Independence did not arrive as freedom. At first, it arrived as responsibility. Paying bills on time, choosing doctors, managing insurance, learning how to ask for help without surrendering control. And each task grounded me further in a life that belonged to me. The emotional work continued long after the paperwork stopped untangling loyalty from obligation, learning that love does not require endurance of harm, and accepting that some people would never agree with the choices I made, because agreement would require them to examine their own silence. I stopped explaining myself to people who asked questions with conclusions already formed, and I learned to recognize curiosity from control by how it listened. Therapy helped not as a confession booth, but as a place to practice trusting my own perception again, to recalibrate instincts that had been trained to doubt themselves, and to grieve without rushing toward forgiveness as a shortcut to comfort. I rebuilt relationships, slowly choosing people who respected boundaries without testing them, and I learned how much lighter connection feels when it is not managed. The protective order eventually expired and was replaced by distance that no longer needed enforcement, not because reconciliation occurred, but because separation had done its work, and I accepted that some endings do not offer closure. In the cinematic sense, they offer space. I thought often about the nurse who pulled the curtain and asked a question without urgency, about how one moment of ethical interruption can redirect a life without drama. And I carried that lesson into my own work, speaking up when patterns appeared, asking questions that made room for truth rather than rushing to resolution. When doubt surfaced, I returned to the basics: documentation over denial, clarity over comfort, and those principles guided decisions large and small. The moral of my story is not that systems are perfect or that leaving is easy. It is that silence is not peace, and blood is not a license to control. Safety grows where boundaries are respected and truth is recorded, and documentation is not about revenge, it is about visibility. If you are listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life, know that you do not have to decide everything at once, that small, accurate steps matter more than dramatic gestures, and that asking the right question can be braver than giving the right answer. I once believed that loyalty meant staying quiet and that independence meant abandonment, and I was wrong about both. Loyalty without accountability erases people, and independence built on truth creates room for growth even when it costs you familiar comfort. If this were your daughter, your sister, someone you loved, what would you tell her to do when a rule feels like a trap and silence feels like survival? I know what I would say now: that she deserves safety without conditions, that her voice matters even when it shakes, and that choosing herself is not cruelty, it is responsibility. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, if you felt that quiet tightening in your chest, or that familiar urge to explain something away, I want you to pause for a moment before you scroll on. Stories like this are not told to shock or to accuse. They are told to name things that too many people were taught to normalize, especially in families where control wears the costume of concern and silence is praised as maturity. If you are listening from the United States or anywhere else in the world, and you have ever wondered whether you were overreacting or being ungrateful or imagining patterns that no one else seemed willing to see, you are not alone, and you are not weak for questioning what does not feel right. This channel exists to slow the moment down, to give language to experiences that are often dismissed, and to remind you that clarity is not cruelty. If you believe stories like this matter, take a second to like this video so it reaches people who may need it more than they know. If you want to be part of a community that values dignity over drama and truth over convenience, consider subscribing, because every week we tell stories that center accountability, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself without applause. I also want to hear from you, not to judge or debate, but to listen. If this were your daughter, your sister, or even your younger self, what would you tell her to do in that moment when a rule crosses the line into control? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you feel comfortable, share where you are listening from, because these stories travel farther than we think, and knowing you are out there reminds others that they are not isolated in their experience. If you recognize yourself in this story and you are in a situation that feels unsafe, please reach out to local support resources or trusted professionals in your area, because asking for help is not a failure, it is a strategy. And if you are someone who has never lived this but stayed to listen anyway, thank you for holding space, because understanding is the first step toward change. Share this story with someone who might need it, not as a warning, but as an invitation to see their life more clearly. Silence protects harm, but attention interrupts it, and sometimes one story heard at the right moment can change the direction of a life.